We have coming on now Ed Saltzman of Cello Health and Ryan Walsh of Real Endpoints, and they're going to have a chat about the providers and payers' perspectives. So, Ed, are you there? I see you coming on. Maybe we can ask you to take the mic and take us home to 6 o'clock, the end of the first day. Please proceed.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Zan, and thank you to everybody at Connexum for another really fabulous conference. This is the truly, and I mean this sincerely, one of the most groundbreaking and exciting conferences I attend, whether it's in personal or virtual form. The only thing I'm missing is that last year, probably in conjunction with the theme, this conference had the most delicious and healthy food at the same time, and I'm missing it. But I am very much looking forward to seeing a few of you at virtual cocktails. Okay, I don't know if some of you have already started, but hopefully we're on the honor system and we won't begin until
we've opened the wine bottle.
We have the job. Ryan and I have the job of taking this home, as Thomas said, in a way that I think maybe even more than last year. What I've heard today is a lot more focus and a lot more reality on the difficulties of the payer side, of the reimbursement side. Last year's conference had some of that. It had, just like this one, a lot of spectacular science, a lot of spectacular vision, a lot of policy, but not a lot of, hey, how are we going to pay for this? So this panel, perhaps situated right before we're supposed to begin cocktails, is really to kind of pour a little reality onto the excitement and the science. And that's not to be a buzzkill. It's not to be, something that says, oh, this is something that, I want to send you out on a depressed note. And indeed, just going by the last discussion, which was fantastic and really fascinating, and Secretary Shalala's discussion and that panel, there's just I think a lot of now movement to understand. So let me just start by a quick introduction. I'm going to hand it off to my my co-panelist, or actually I think there's somebody who actually knows a lot more about this subject than I do, Ryan. But so I'm Ed Saltzman. I'm the executive chairman of Cello Health BioConsulting. The bio is in the book, so I won't talk about that. But as a strategy consultant working with early stage companies developing scientific platforms, I will make a striking observation. And that is the overwhelming percentage of the work that pays my living is working for companies that are developing therapies for ill people, okay, for sick people. Overwhelmingly, or at least half of it is metastatic disease focused. A tremendous amount, okay, is focused on autoimmune and inflammatory diseases that are very, very burdensome to people and to their quality of life. And by no means do I want to suggest that that isn't proper. Also, a tremendous percentage of what I get paid for is to work with companies in rare diseases, okay, in very, very small, tiny patient populations. So this idea of, this large form, this large focus is tremendous and very, 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 very exciting, because we don't get to do it very much, and hopefully we'll start to do it a lot more. So I think what we want to do in this brief session is just convince you how important the payers are going to be as stakeholders, all right? And that that you, and when I say you, I'm speaking collectively to the audience, and I'm speaking to us, to all of us, really have to have an appreciation as to just how vital and how important this is going to be. Because if all of this science is going to see the light of day, the payer is going to have to be dealt with, okay? And I don't mean dealt with in terms of managed, I mean educated, okay? And I'll make one observation before I hand it off to Ryan, is that in my experience in working with payers, and Ryan has considerably more experience, payers don't educate themselves very, very well, okay? And when they educate themselves, it is within a very narrow lens that tends to be the way they distill the world and the way they see their focus. So what I want, I think, everybody to take out of the session is how important this communication is going to be with payers. But when we talk about payers, we're talking about particularly in the US, especially in the US, we're talking about a complex, fragmented system of just extraordinary, complexity. So I'm going to hand it off to Ryan, allow Ryan to introduce himself and tell you a little bit about what he does, and then we'll get into the discussion. So Ryan?
Yeah, thank you, Ed, and thank you everyone for hosting me and Ed for this session today. We were excited to really have this time slot at the end of the first day. A lot of great presentations and a lot of very relevant conversation to the future forward of all of this science and how we bring it to market effectively. So by way of background, the majority of my professional career has actually been on the manufacturer side, as well as in different areas of supply chain, working for large retail and specialty pharmacy providers, and most recently joining Real Endpoints, in the capacity of client services, where I get to work with manufacturers and biotechs of all shapes and sizes, big and small, challenges that are all very large. But as a strategic consultancy focused entirely on market access, we really take a look at all of the dynamics and interconnections that impact how a patient effectively gets on the right drug at the right time. And what I'd say, as much as we're going to talk a lot about payers today and the role that they play and the ever increasing role that they play in healthcare delivery and access to drugs in the US, market access is really much larger than that. And we view it as the entire continuum of factors and dynamics that impact healthcare delivery. So certainly there's a component on one end related to pricing and rebate contracting and formulary coverage and reimbursement, but it goes well beyond that when you really think about the challenges in drug delivery. And there's, of course, a distribution and supply chain dynamic, working with wholesalers and other intermediaries, of course, a dispensing component, whether working with retail, specialty, or mail order pharmacies. And then ever increasing is really how manufacturers smooth out some of those bumps through patient and provider support. And historically, that's been very focused on clinical support for therapies, but increasingly it's really around financial and reimbursement support, really breaking down those barriers and walls to effectively getting a patient on drug, independent of whether or not it's covered by a payer or what the affordability and copay and coinsurance are at the patient level. And all of those kind of factors and dynamics together are really what make up market access in the US today.
So, Ryan, I think that, a good place to start or continue this discussion, the segue that you've provided is something that I think we think about a lot. I know your firm and our firm does. And we're speaking particularly to the companies in the room, the companies out there, the early stage companies that are pursuing geroscience, longevity, a variety of tremendous and exciting, scientific approaches. And the majority of the companies, by nature of the field itself, is at a very early stage of development. So, there's a tendency to look at the valuations of the company as being associated with the scientific, biological, clinical development risk cost. But I would make the argument, and I hope to be a little bit provocative on this, that some percent of their valuation, I don't want to be presumptuous to think what it is being constrained, and therefore their cost of capital is increasing by the fact that they aren't putting the issues of payers and reimbursement front and center in their communication, in their planning, in speaking to their boards, in speaking to investors. What do you think about that? Does that seem like a reasonable hypothesis?
Yeah, no, and I think it's a great point that you raise. In our worlds, between your organization and mine, are growing ever closer because of that. I think the role and the influence of payers specifically in healthcare delivery has become incredibly important. There's really no product or therapy that is that is for prescription, that is not going to in some ways be impacted by a payer's management and reimbursement or lack thereof. And we are starting, I think much like you, to have earlier and earlier conversations, particularly with smaller biotechs, in preparation for commercialization and through later stages of product development, to really understand what is the access and reimbursement landscape like for a given product. The types of questions that we start to see coming from investors are not only, do you think you have a quality product that is safe and effective and fills some unmet need, but how do payers in and of themselves interpret that unmet need? What will be the speed to access for patients, but also the quality of access? So having a drug covered and potentially on formulary is important, but it's not the full picture of what that therapy will cost the patient, where it will be delivered and how accessible it will be, and what type of restrictions or utilization management might be put on the drug that would ultimately constrain the provider and the patient getting access to it. And so I think, what we've spent a lot of time doing with clients is really, educating them around the motivators and drivers and incentives that payers have in evaluating new therapeutic categories, or in many cases, older areas of science and disease, but with new modalities coming to market, and how they do a trade-off analysis of what these products are really worth for the member lives that they're covering. And it's very different than regulators may look at these products and assign value to them. And I think, having an understanding of that payer evaluation, and the way that they assign value to new drugs is really a requirement for everyone working at a manufacturer and in this space. They're too large a stakeholder today to not be at least reasonably well understood by everyone working in clinical development all the way through commercialization.
So one of the things that I'm actually going to transition into a comment that that Thomas sent in. One of the things that I suspect we're talking about, there's a bit of an essential tension here in all of the discussions as to whether we are talking about, for the proposed interventions in development, whether we're talking about small populations, whether they be at risk, genetically defined, which is sort of the flavor du jour in pharma development right now, and which actually, despite some of the eye-popping prices, you and I both know that from a payer point of view, the actual budget impact, right, on a lot of these plans from some of these rare diseases, despite the designer costs of these drugs, is de minimis, or in some cases non-existent. And yet we also know that payers tend to have a bit of a freak out where we talk about, branded priced drugs for large populations. So for instance, what happened to the PCSK9 antibodies, where payers literally sat and to my mind, pretty much destroyed an entire very promising, class of drugs. Now, given the pricing, the payers may have been justified in the tools that they use and what they did, but that just strikes me as one of the issues is when we bring innovation to large populations, okay? And this ties into longevity dividend. How do we factor that and think about that within our very, very the sort of disconnected system where we have turnover, we have planned turnover, consistently, and we're looking for that long-term longevity, dividend. So does sort of set up that question, and I'll ask Thomas's question, which is a little bit more specific.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And look, I think, again, having an appreciation for what payers are up against maybe helps to understand some of their motivations and what at times can seem very punitive in terms of coverage and reimbursement for new therapies. But payers are covering, very expensive products for very small populations. They're covering less expensive products for very broad populations. They've done a great job of driving generic utilization in a lot of categories that I think are at the heart of what we're discussing today, and allowing for access to chronic medication therapy in a number of these different areas. I think, it was mentioned, I think a great point towards the end of Jay and Dana's session a few moments ago, communicating with payers, helping them to understand, what the target is that we're trying to treat towards, what the value of the investment in these therapies is incredibly important. As you said, they do an okay job of educating themselves, but probably only to their own end and for their own means. And it takes time, I think, to shape understanding and acceptance of new ways or new paradigms in care and management, and in this case, healthy aging. I think, payers are up against a lot. They're the same person is trying to forecast and budget for an influx of cell and gene therapies that could potentially cost millions of dollars per year or really per cure. And if you have a couple of these patients within your membership lives, which many of the larger payers will, it's incredibly hard to manage and account for, and you're going to likely have to give access to those therapies. So I think that's where the trade-offs come, is that you can't cover everything all the time and at the level of access or quality of access that others might want. So how do you prioritize? How do you understand the value of different treatment targets or different approaches to manage disease or to improve wellness? And that it's not an easy calculation for payers to make. So I think the more foresight and predictability they have into what's coming down the pipeline, what will be approved by the FDA and regulators, and therefore what will they be asked to cover and reimburse, I think, it's really important to spend that time doing that education.
So I think you may have partially answered Thomas's question, but let me pose it and maybe you have more specific comments, because you actually spend your time with the Kaisers of the world, the United Healths. I'm not sure how much time on the CMS side, but when we think about both the public side, CMS, we think about the private side, the Kaisers, the United Healths, the big plans, the integrated plans. Are they actually thinking about healthy aging or healthy longevity? Is that on their agenda? Does payer radar sort of see this, coming? In that, how does that? I guess the way to ask the question is, in the UK, obviously it's probably an easier sell in the sense that you've got single payer systems, all throughout Europe. Well, everywhere in the developed world except the U.S., right? So, if you could payers buy into the long-term goals here, given the nature of the system in the U.S. without vast systemic change?
I think they can, and so I think your kind of the start of the question was really around is any of this or all of this or some of it on the payer's radar? I'll tell you what. We spend a lot of time as a practice and kind of a requirement of the business doing is monitoring, payer pipeline reports, payer drug trend reports. Most of them, at least the larger health plans and PBMs, actually do a very good job of highlighting what is on their radar and at least putting a signal out to the marketplace of the budget busters that they're concerned with, the categories that are rising in drug utilization and spend that they intend to manage more heavily. So it's not always a mystery what they're thinking. I think access to a lot of these payers to help educate and adapt behavior and work with them is constrained because there are so many things that they're trying to manage and customers that want access to their time. But I think to your question around, does any of this ever work outside of a single payer system like the UK, where maybe it's a government entity that owns the health and wellness of the individual for their lifetime? I do think that there's opportunity to highlight, not just what is the benefit of healthy aging at the end. So right before, I think Jay in the last session mentioned, right before you hit that red zone component of your aging in your lifetime, but really what is the value What is the, the reduction in medical cost utilization, in drug utilization by managing patients earlier on? And as much as we have a very fragmented system with lots of different payer types, it's becoming less and less different as we move forward. So less than 10 payers cover the majority of commercially insured lives, cover the majority of Part D lives. So you're seeing, just this consolidation, but also a degree of integration. So the major health plans in the US are now fully aligned and integrated with the major PBMs, with generally their own specialty pharmacies to prescribing, oftentimes with their own infusion or home care networks. And so it is changing. And I think we're really at a moment of opportunity where perhaps this, the conversation around wellness will resonate to a degree that it has not necessarily in the past.
Yeah, there's a question that's come in, but I suspect, like many questions that have come in, it's more of a comment, and I think it relates to the centrality of obesity. This is the Metabesity conference as so much of a central issue here, obviously being the #1 cause of type 2 diabetes, but that, we still don't have good drugs for obesity. I think it's more of a comment, and I think there's been a lot of very interesting discussion around approaches to obesity, and there'll be continue to be throughout this conference. So I am going to talk about pharma though a little bit, because we made I think last year, and you just started going there, so I'm going to keep you on the topic, Ryan. I think last year, we spent a lot of time, a lot of our brief time, discussing this sort of, this kind of vertical alignment, of what's going on out there in the real world in terms of the large players. Okay, when I talk about, the large players, they are the CVSs of the world, the Walgreens of the world, also, the United Healths of the world, all the way that this sort of, the players are coming together, in a vertically integrated, sort of fashion. And what's interesting to me about it is that, and we talked about it last year, is pharma's kind of on the outside looking in, right? So, it may be that it will be necessary for advocacy to those evolving enormous entities, okay, for pharma to actually be interested. Because I keep thinking about, and Thomas and Zan, I didn't look at the registration list for this conference, but one of the things that concerned me was, outside of a couple of representatives on the panel last year, was not a lot of representation from large pharma. And I think if we're going to move this topic further, we've got to get large pharma more involved. I think large pharma has to be a considerable player. But if you go back to where I started, large pharma is still overwhelmingly focused on selling drugs for sick people, okay? There are a couple of notable exceptions, by the way, just as a side note, including a class of drugs that, if you look at the sales of statin drugs for primary prevention, okay, not secondary prevention, which is an established coronary artery disease, but people who are just deemed to be slightly risky, okay, for an event, and you look at the percentage of sales in the market that are for primary prevention, it's overwhelmingly for primary prevention. So you could make the argument that pharma has benefited enormously from just a single class of drugs, okay, to extend life, extend longevity, which statins inarguably do, okay, and reduce events, reduce burden to the healthcare system. And now, with that entire class available generically, for pennies on the dollar, the system benefits, nearly forever, right? So how do we get pharma more engaged in the conversation, with the understanding that right now, if the system starts to come together, pharma is kind of the odd man out, right? I mean, you're going to have a whole medicine chest worth of drugs for treating disease, and yet the system may evolve to what, Thomas and the team at Connexum have posed as this, longevity dividend, looking a little bit more term. And we'll end with a couple of thoughts about COVID and the impact that may have on accelerating, but that's a long enough question in and of itself.
Sorry to Ryan to step in, but I just want to make
Yeah.
sure you guys had a chance to listen to the session with Stephen Goff and with Antonio Tatarani. It's really fascinating to me that just in the past 12 months, since the last year's Metabesity, the thinking that's been put in by a pharmaceutical company, Novo, and how forward-thinking PepsiCo, a food giant,
Right.
is about looking into this space. So my question, I guess, is, are they representative of what's the iceberg under the water? Is everybody doing that? Are they 2 standard deviations over on the right end of the curve, that the bleeding edge of large companies who are thinking about these sorts of things and how to transform their business model and their products to take advantage of what may be coming down the pike? I know we're down to the last couple minutes, so just throwing it out there.
Yeah. So I'll just try to comment, and then I'm going to close this out. I think that I think, really importantly, I mean, I spend a lot of time with pharma companies, with biotech companies, with investors, and while this conference is extraordinarily exciting, this is not yet on the agenda of large pharma. Over a decade ago, I actually spent time with the CEO of a large pharma company who I won't mention, and with a team that had created an aging-related unit and an aging initiative, and we were charged to develop some strategic thinking around it. And when I postulated that this would be an investment, it would take place over a period of at least a decade, I was met with the reaction that no, this has to be something accretive, near-term accretive. Okay, so pharma focuses on the near term, just as much as payers may focus on the near term. So I think to your comment, Thomas, I think it's going to be very, very challenging. We have a minute, so I think that and when I talk with Ryan to plan it, I brought up the subject of the pandemic and the impact this would have going forward. There's been a bunch of discussion of this at this meeting, so in the interest of time, we won't go there. Ryan did say, I think people might be pandemic'd out. I think it's very important to see what the former secretary of HHS told us, which is, quite frankly, she said, there's not going to be a lot of money after COVID. And so the discussion of finite resources and how we spend that money and how we bring that in is we're going to be living with that for a really, really long time. And I think that's not a challenge for this field. I think that's an opportunity for this field. So with that, I think I'm going to close it out, and I think we will be almost right on time. There is, I have a few questions, but we can probably reply by email. I can get them circulated. I'll get that circulated to you, Ryan. You can see the questions as well. Yep. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Thomas or Zan or Adrian, and thank you very much for another fabulous day. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Throwing it to Zan and Adrian.
Well, Ed, I love every time you speak. You were terrific at M19. You and Ryan did a great job then, and same this year, even better. You really meet the rubber to the road and talking about what needs to be done to get products to people. If they're not going to be paid for, if we don't have evidence to justify the payment, then they're not going to ever do any good. So you guys are at the real fulcrum of where we've got to make the difference. So again, thank you very much.